This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, land their dream job, and demonstrate their impact to their most important stakeholders. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that distills complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. It is great to have Ali Divan on the show today. Ali has a Ph.D. in medical sciences, which he received from Texas A&M. He actually never thought he'd end up in science, but in his 20s, he was sent on a path from which there is no return. He's an explorer at heart. He enjoys venturing into the unknown. And actually, he was on the academic path until he hit a ceiling as a postdoc. And then from there, he worked in industry and he saw every side of it: quality, operations, R&D, big companies, medium companies, startups. But eventually couldn't escape the little voice he was hearing in his head, guiding him to build something of his own. So in the summer of 2023, he launched Trulitica. And he did it because there are three major stakeholders in the life science industry that he wants to serve. And we are going to talk about them, the company, his journey in just a minute. Welcome to the show, Ali.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Ali, we had a chance to talk about music and guitar playing and found that we both share a love of guitar playing. And we also chatted about the links between music and science and storytelling, and particularly when it comes to the structure of different pieces of music, scales, riffs, things like that, and how it relates to storytelling. And I'd love for you to share those insights and the thoughts that you had with listeners.
Yeah, sure. One of my favorite bands growing up, and still to this day, is Metallica. And I started playing guitar in 7th grade, and I started on electric. And all I wanted to do was be able to play some of my favorite songs. And so one of my favorite Metallica songs it's actually a cover of a Thin Lizzy song. It's called Whiskey in the Jar. What I really like about it is the way that it starts, just immediately, like, I can feel it. I can connect with it. And the lyrics tell a great story. But in addition to that, it has this build up to this solo, which sounds awesome and actually isn't that difficult to play. And a lot of that, I think, is the same as storytelling, regardless of whether you're telling it with an instrument or with your voice, whether you're telling it in writing, and the context of whether it's science or business or these other things. I think there are some fundamental elements of the story that are present regardless of what medium you're using to tell it.
Yeah, so true. And when you pointed out that song, Whiskey in a Jar, really grabs your attention right away. I think sometimes people, when they're constructing stories, don't appreciate the need to do that right away. Like, you really do have to hook them in the first 10 seconds. And you get that with music a lot of times, these famous riffs, it just still stays with you. I mentioned you earned your PhD in medical sciences, and you weren't one of those people, though, who knew since the 3rd grade that you wanted to be a scientist, which I think is really cool too. And so can you share with listeners your journey to your PhD?
Yeah, I wish I knew. In terms of what I wanted to do to begin with, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life at any point growing up. And even when I went to college, I ended up studying economics because I was able to follow the reasoning and I liked it. And then I was doing business and economics, and my intent was, yeah, I'll just do this and I'll make a lot of money. I didn't really have any real passion or real mission in terms of what I wanted to do. I was like, I'll just make money and then do cool stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that. But one thing that I really enjoyed doing and still enjoy doing is being outdoors and hiking and being out in the mountains. And At some point during my college career, I traveled to Connecticut. I traveled to Northern California, did a lot of hiking in both places. Didn't really notice any kind of weird event while I was hiking. But when I came back, when it was, I think it was over spring break, when I came back, I had this weird rash on my shoulder, which was like dark, but wasn't painful or anything like that. And then it went away. Honestly thought nothing of it. And I was doing judo at the time. So I was like, oh, it's probably just mat burn or something like that. And then shortly thereafter, I started having all these like really odd joint and tendon problems, which I'd never had before. And then my memory started being affected. I remember I was reading a book and I was like halfway through a paragraph and I just couldn't remember what I was reading. And I think the scariest part was I remember distinctly going to the supermarket and I wanted to ask where the asparagus was. And I started stuttering when I was saying asparagus. And I was like, what is going on here? So I started freaking out. Anyway, several months went by where I saw different doctors. And I was going to school in Washington State at the time. And at that time, I think it was like 2006, 2007. I think that Lyme disease probably wasn't really on the radar then because it was thought not to be very prevalent there. But nobody had asked me, have you traveled anywhere? And so it took quite a long time for me to get a diagnosis, 3 or 4 months. But eventually it did become clear, yes, you got Lyme disease. And so because of how long it had been since I contracted it versus when I was treated, it ended up being a little bit complicated. I did end up having to go on IV antibiotics and I took a year off of school just to deal with it. And so that was during my junior year of college. And so once I felt good enough to go back to school, my passion had changed, right? Like my actually had something that I was interested in. My experience with this disease, my experience with my doctors and all these other things inspired me a little bit. I was like, oh, hey, I thought we knew so much about medicine. I thought we knew so much about biology. And I knew, that was just based on ignorance that I had thought that. But then suddenly I was like, you know what? I think I want to study this. I think this is something I could get into. But because the university that I had gone to during undergrad was a private university and it was expensive, and because I had taken a medical leave of absence, I had lost my scholarships and grants. And even if I had gotten those back, I was a junior when I left and I took a year off. Most of my good friends had graduated. And so I didn't see the value in going back there. And so what I ended up doing was going back to a junior college that my dad taught at, taking all my science prereqs for a year, transferring to a state college at CSU Chico and studying biochemistry there. And then from there, I thought I wanted to go to medical school. I thought I wanted to be a physician because I was so inspired by my physicians. I took the MCAT and started my application process, but also volunteering at a clinic. And what I found during that process was that I think I had romanticized what a doctor does. And when I got to be in their shoes, it turned out not to be the career path that I wanted to pursue. It seemed really stressful. It seemed that there was a lot of really challenging patient interactions and a lot of what I had imagined was like an episode of House or something. And that's just not the way it works. And so what I ended up figuring out was that my real passion was actually in the puzzle. It was in trying to understand how things work. And I had taken an immunology course in undergrad, and I had done a journal club presentation that this particular immunology lab had published, and I was really passionate about it. And so what I ended up doing is reaching out to that investigator and making a decision to go to graduate school and pursue my Ph.D. And that's how I ended up in science.
I think it's wonderful to share that story too, because sometimes people feel, well, if I don't know right away, that's a problem. And what's wrong with me? And everyone else seems to know their path. And those things are really oftentimes stories that we tell ourselves, but they're not true. And the fact that you found now your passion, and this is how you ended up in science. And then you went on this exploration, excavation, hunt really to figure out what was going on with Lyme disease treatment, hunting down answers and not relenting until you found the answer. And that's really unusual. I was so interested in how you described that and the journey that you went on.
I remember at that time when I had entered graduate school in this immunology lab, one of the things that my PI had mentioned in one of the papers that she had written was that there was a particular peptide she was working on, and it could be relevant to post-infectious inflammatory sequelae and in many diseases. And Lyme disease was one of the ones that she had mentioned. And so that I knew that in this lab, there was a possibility or an opportunity for me to focus on this disease and also the causative agent, which is the bacteria. It took me some time to figure out how am I going to investigate that. And when I looked at the literature and from my own experiences, it seemed that the neurologic aspect of this disease was not very well understood. And there's a good reason for that. Because when people end up with neurologic Lyme disease, they don't die from it. And which is good. That's great. But as a result of that, there's no opportunity to get biopsies. There's no opportunity to study it in any way that's non-invasive. And so what's known is mostly from animal models or from things pertinent to drawing blood or drawing cerebrospinal fluid. The paradigm at the time was that this cannot be modeled in mice. And that was settled science that was claimed to be known. And that was the paradigm for 3 decades. And so the majority of the studies that had been done to elucidate some of the mechanisms here were done in rhesus macaques. And they're very expensive to work with. What I've heard is that it's about $50,000 per animal just for all the upkeep and all the other related expenses. And so you can imagine if you have limited funding and it's $50,000 per animal, you're pretty limited in how many animals you can model this neurologic disease in. And then there's some ethical considerations too, right? Now we're talking about monkeys versus rodents. And then when I looked at the types of studies that were being done, I really questioned the contextual relevance. A lot of these studies, the animals were being immunosuppressed with steroids and then hundreds of ticks being put on these animals. And my question was, what does that have to do with the human condition? What does that how is that modeling what people experience? People aren't pumping themselves for full steroids and rolling around in ticks. They're going for a hike. And so what I really wanted to do was challenge this paradigm of, you can't model this in rodents. When I looked at the literature, I kept seeing this statement that you cannot model it in rodents because it does not get into the brain in rodents. But I couldn't find the evidence. And so I kept digging and I kept looking at the citations and everything seemed to cross-cite other things, but I couldn't find the original thing. And then eventually I found the original thing. And in the original paper, what they claimed was not what everybody else said they claimed. In the original paper, what they showed is that it's transiently positive in the brain. And that made me curious. Why transiently? Why is it not reproducible? And so I dug a little deeper. At that time, the meninges, specifically the dura mater, was really a hot topic. And that's because there was a lymphatic system that had been identified there. And so I dug a little deeper and found, a lot of the proteins that this particular bacteria binds to and is attracted to are expressed in the dura. And I didn't see studies investigating that. And so the deeper I dug, the more it seemed, at least preliminarily, that this could be an area where this bacteria lives. And if that's the case, that would totally explain why the brain cultures were only sometimes positive, because you're not always 100% efficient in removing little chunks of the meninges off the brain when you're doing these animal studies. And so that's what I pursued. And what I found out was that 100% of the time, the meninges are infected, at least in these animal studies. It can be modeled in rodents. Rodents are a fantastic model for it. There are even the timing, the kinetics of it matches what you see in the clinic when people present with neuroborreliosis. And that was told to me by somebody who I thought would be my biggest critic when I presented it. And he said, well, this actually matches pretty well with what we see in people. I felt really fortunate that I came into this wanting to challenge a lot of the paradigm, and that the lab that I was in wasn't strictly a lab that studied Lyme disease. And so we weren't predisposed to already accepting dogs. We were a lab that just openly studied immunology in the context of a lot of different diseases with respect to the host response.
So cool. Really interesting. Just refusing to accept dogma, as you put it. And then after more digging, realizing that what had been repeated over and over again was not actually accurate. Now, I guess what I want to ask you now, of course, is about your company. Trulitica partners with investors, life science companies, subject matter experts to deliver consistent returns, effective product launches, rewarding careers through expert advising. So tell us more. What problems does it solve, and how can you learn more about the company?
Yeah, sure. So I launched this company recently, and it was based on some of the experiences I had before joining industry and some of the experience I had while in industry. And so there's three main stakeholders here that I intend to serve specifically in the life sciences, as you mentioned. One of them is investors. And the way that I help investors is by performing technical due diligence for them. And the rationale for this is that on the industrial side, I see a lot of investments made in life science ideas that are good ideas, but can sometimes be overstated. They can sometimes be hyped up a little bit too much. And especially now, the amount of funding that investors can put into startups is finite. And so what I'd really like to do, both from a financial perspective, but also a social perspective, is to help investors put their money into companies who have real technology, and that this technology, that the intent of the company isn't just to build up the hype and get it acquired, but it's to actually produce something that's meaningful for human health. Investors are really savvy when it comes to the business side of things, but they know that there's a technical side that they need an expert to put eyes on. And so that's what I intend to do, is to look at the milestones that are being proposed and say, okay, is this technically feasible? Look at the claims that are being made. Is that true? Are there other interpretations? What are the limitations of the model? So that's what I do for investors on the company side. I spent a long time in the life sciences launching products, technical product launches. So really finding a way to inform specifications for a product in a way that meets the market requirement, but also matches manufacturing capabilities. That also involves coordinating, collaborating with operations people. It involves working with quality assurance and quality control and R&D. Because I had the opportunity to work in all those roles, I know from direct experience that these groups speak different languages. It can be very difficult to meet your project milestone and be audit proof and have a good product. And what I find is that there isn't usually a single person dedicated to that, solving that problem, or responsible for solving that problem. Very often it's divided between a lot of different managers, and it's very challenging. And so one of the reasons that I want to provide this service is because the product launch process can be so chaotic, and it can result in late nights, and it can result in burnout. And so what I want to do is help companies produce something of value, but also do it in a way where you're creating a work environment where people want to come to work, where it's not just what's the next emergency. It's, oh yeah, hey, this is a pretty well-oiled machine, and we have the right people in the right place to have a good work environment and a good product.
Ali, as part of your work with Trulitica, you're also helping PhDs. Tell us some more about that.
Yeah, so this is something I'm really passionate about. It's something that I'm doing because of my own experiences during my PhD, during my postdoc. One of the things that's very difficult for PhDs to do, just because of resources, is it's difficult to leave academia and get into industry. And this is really important. It's an important skill to have, because in terms of the market, there's only about 5% of graduating PhDs can get jobs in faculty roles. And it's not a talent issue. It's a math issue. There's just not enough spots. And so for all these other people, the other 95% who can't get in, who are very talented, they need resources to do something. And I know that on the academic side, career advisors are very aware of this issue. They want to bring in outside help. There's no budget for it. And what I do is I spend time one-on-one with PhDs who are 90% there. They just don't know necessarily, how do I network? How do I write a clear, concise, targeted resume in a way that's industrial? Because the way you're taught to write a resume in academia, it's a CV. It's everything you've ever done. When you're applying for a job, people don't want to know everything you've ever done. They want to know what you've done that's relevant to them. I also help them with industry-specific scientific talks, how to do an interview with a hiring manager. I teach them about typical salary ranges based on their geographic area, and then also help them understand the landscape of benefits, because in academia, as a postdoc, somebody tells you about, 401k, you have an FSA, there's an HSA, here are all your different benefits. You're almost ignored and forgotten, and just get them up to speed on this.
Really so important. Thanks for sharing those details. And we'll, of course, have information about Trulitica and how listeners can get in touch with you and take advantage of some of these services and resources that you offer. Where do you think that persistence comes from in your background?
So I think in many ways, our strengths are also our weaknesses. My strength is that I tend not to give up. And so if there's a really important thing that needs to be solved, I'm probably going to see it all the way to the end. Or if I find that there's an obstacle that would be incredibly difficult to overcome, I've learned that a pivot is probably the better option. Sometimes it's easier to go around an obstacle than just bulldoze right through it. But on the flip side, if there's a small problem that maybe doesn't need to be solved, I've had to learn to let things go. I've had to learn to say, okay, you know what? We have 100 problems. We can't solve all of them. Let's focus on the 10 that give us the most value.
I think that's a really smart approach. And it's a lesson that oftentimes people don't learn until a little bit later in life. And as we wrap up, we're talking in August of 2023. And given this element of your persona that we've been talking about, this persistence gene, if you will, where would you like to be professionally a year from now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I find that every time I've tried to plan my life, it doesn't go the way you think it will. What I like to do is set these general ideas of what's a general direction that we want this to go in. And what I would have liked to have done a year from now is help several PhDs find a way into industry through direct mentorship and also building a community for them. I'd like to have helped several investors put money into companies that have really strong founders with really good tech and see that tech actually moving in a way that's going to make a lasting impact. And then clearly, I'd like to have been involved in at least a handful of, maybe 2 or 3, realistically, product launches where we see those products produce something meaningful for the market and produce a sense of camaraderie and teamwork among the people who work together to launch them.
Wonderful. Just a wonderful conversation. Ali Divan, your story is really inspiring on many different dimensions. Thanks so much for taking the time to share it with me and listeners today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks, and I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.